Again this week, we're talking about faith. Too often we think that having faith means that we have arrived. It's as if faith is our purpose, but the definition of faith that we read last week, the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen, doesn't support the idea that if we have faith, we have achieved our purpose. Sadly, however, many people believe this. Some churches teach it. The same is true of the idea of being born again, of which Jesus speaks of in the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. If someone can just be born again, we think they have it all together. They have all that they need. But we forget, birth isn't an instant process. Birth is not something that we achieve and then is quickly over with. In fact, we don't achieve birth. It takes parents. We're not involved. And there's that 9-month gestation period of which we don't have any control. And then even once we come into the world, we're still pretty helpless. We can't feed ourselves. We can't even move. Birth is just the beginning of a growth process, which makes it a perfect metaphor for a life of faith. Likewise, faith is a growth process as we step out of our comfort zones and grow into a more trusting relationship with God. We can look back, as the author of Hebrews does, to see how others have trusted God. We can also look back into our own lives and see where God has been present with us when we have been in need. Such knowledge of God's work in the past helps us to mature in faith. And as we grow in faith, we also grow as a disciple. And that's what the church is to be about, making disciples. Like the early church, we're called to live with confidence that God has things under control. We're not to be in a hurry. Making disciples is not something that is done in an instant. Helping God bring forth the kingdom takes more than a few volunteer hours. We're talking about investments of lifetimes of people who, trusting and working with the Holy Spirit, can help others mature as Christians. And we need to remember that we're just a vessel who needs to be open to the Spirit as we live our lives as disciples. Our text for today is from the 11th chapter of Hebrews. It'll be my second of 3 sermons from this chapter, and today we'll be looking at verses 8 through 22, and I'll be reading this from the Message translation to give you kind of a fresh hearing of this passage. By an act of faith, Abraham said yes to God's call to travel to an unknown place that would become his home. When he left, he had no idea where he was going. By an act of faith, he lived in the country promised him, lived as a stranger camping in tents. Isaac and Jacob the same, living under the same promise. Abraham did it by keeping his eye on an unseen city with real eternal foundations, the city designed and built by God. By faith, barren Sarah was able to become pregnant, old woman as she was at the time, because she believed the one who made a promise would do what he said. That's how it happened, that from one man's dead and shriveled loins, there are now people numbering into the millions. Each one of these people of faith died not yet having a hand in what was promised, but still believing. How did they do it? They saw it way off in the distance, waved their greetings, and accepted the fact that they were transients in this world. People who lived this way make it plain that they are looking for their true home. If they were homesick for the old country, they could have gone back anytime they wanted. But they were after a far better country than that, heaven country. You can see why God is so proud of them and has a city waiting for them. By faith, Abraham, at the time of testing, offered Isaac back to God. Acting in faith, he was ready to return the promised son, his only son, as he had been to receive him. And after he had already been told, your descendants shall come from Isaac, Abraham figured that if God wanted to, he could raise the dead. In a sense, that's what happened when he received Isaac back alive from off the altar. By an act of faith, Isaac reached into the future as he blessed Jacob and Esau. By an act of faith, Jacob on his deathbed blessed each of Joseph's sons in turn, blessing them with God's blessing, not his own, as he bowed worshipful upon his staff. By an act of faith, Joseph, while dying, prophesied the exodus of Israel and made arrangement for his own burial. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I tend not to be superstitious, and I place little trust in premonitions. However, on my first solo trip across country, something happened that I still find strange. I entered unfamiliar territory as I left Missouri and crossed over Kansas on I-70. At this time in my life, I had flown across the country a couple of times out to California, but that vast land of our country between Missouri and the West Coast was all unfamiliar to me. Around midday, as I drove up on a familiar-looking car, one that was going just slightly under the speed limit. Now, this was in 1988. And the car that I saw and I was approaching was a two-tone 55 Buick. A red body, a black roof, and lots of chrome, shiny chrome. I gave my turn signal and I moved into the left lane to pass. And when I pulled up beside the car, I looked over. And not only was this car identical to the first car that I remember my parents owning, but the driver also looked familiar. He had dark hair, black framed glasses, and wore a t-shirt and a beige hard-shelled jungle hat. His left arm hung out of the window, which was rolled down. And he saw me take a second look back at him, and he kind of nodded and smiled. Now, the man looked just like my dad looked 20 years earlier. I'd seen Dad wear that same hat when we would go over to Dunk's Pond to fish. And I wondered what had happened to that car which my dad had traded in 25 or so years earlier. And as I sped down the highway, I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, thinking about my dad and wondering about this man who could have been his twin. A bit later, I pulled off the freeway and into a small town of Paxco. Main Street there consisted of just a few buildings on one side of the street, and on the south side of the street, kind of between Main Street and the freeway, was the Southern Pacific tracks. There was a small bar and grill there, and I retreated there to get out of the intense heat and sun. And inside it was dark and cool, and I ate a burger and listened to farmers in overalls drinking beer at the bar, expressing their hope that they might get some rain that afternoon. 30 minutes later, I was back on the road. And sure enough, in the distance, huge thunderheads, reminiscent of the cowboy song Riders, Ghost Riders of the Sky, loomed, and lightning began to streak across the sky. And even inside an air-conditioned car, I could tell that the temperature outside was dropping. And then came the winds, and I had to hold on tight to the wheel. And next I entered the darkness, which came with pounding rain that was just so hard that I couldn't even hear the radio. And it was over as quickly as it started. And the highway stretched into the west, and steam rose from the wet asphalt, and out of that haze, I saw the car again. That 55 Buick. I would pass him several more times that afternoon, and even once the next morning, before I turned off and headed north to pick up I-80 for the drive across Wyoming. Now, unlike Abraham, I knew my destination. I was headed to Idaho, where I would spend a summer running a camp, and then on to Virginia City in the fall, where I would spend a year as an intern pastor. But it was a bit unnerving, for I was in this strange land where I knew no one, and yet that 55 Buick, whose driver could have been my dad 20 years earlier, reminded me that perhaps I was not really all alone. No, my Father was not with me, but our Father in heaven was there. I like the Frederick Buechner quote I included in this week's bulletin. Faith is not being sure of where you're going, but going anyway. And that's Abraham, heading westward through the desert. And in a way, it was me as I went to seminary and then accepted the internship out west in this strange land where at first I felt as if I was a foreigner. Our passage today speaks of faith as a journey as we look back into the past. The preacher of Hebrews is rather fond of Abraham, because this is the fourth time Abraham is mentioned in this book. But it's not just about Abraham, for he brings up his wife Sarah and his sons and two of his grandsons and even his great-grandson, Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph. They're all mentioned. God made a promise to these ancestors of our faith, but none of them saw that promise fulfilled. They, like us, are transients in the world, knowing that the true home for which they belong is that city God prepares. The thing we learn about all of them is how they grew in faith. I mean, Abraham took one step of faith to leave his homeland and becoming a Bedouin, wandering around in the ancient Near East. He took a second step of faith when he refused to hold back anything required by God, including, if required, the sacrifice of Isaac, the only son of Sarah, the heir of the promise. Each of the patriarchs showed faith by extending their blessings to their children. And Joseph, the last, as mentioned, that we hear of here, at his deathbed, displays faith by asking that his bones not remain in Egypt, but they be taken and be buried in the promised land. And that wouldn't be until another 400 years has passed. Speaking of faith and that which we cannot see. Like our ancestors, we too are only passing through this life, yet we are to have faith in what God is doing in our world. It's easy to think that things are going downhill when we look at everything in our world, but we as followers of Jesus are to be optimistic. We have hope. We lay our hope not in the ways of the things of the world, but in the ways of God. Where do we see God at work in the world today? You know, it's easy to get upset because everybody starts citing all of these figures about congregations and denominations in America that are declining. And we know it's now true that there are more people not a member of a church than members of the church in America for the first time since they've been doing that kind of polling. Yet at the same time, the church is growing by leaps and bounds in Africa and in Asia. Perhaps we have too long thought of ourselves as God's gift to the world, that we have forgotten that God's ways are not our ways. God is not inactive in our world today. I recently had a conversation with Stuart, your former minister, and we discussed the book about his grandfather, the man who moved a mountain. And Stuart told me about how people after reading the book are often amazed at his grandfather. And he admitted, yes, God did some pretty amazing things through him, but we got to keep the emphasis on what God did and not on what his grandfather did. In fact, he said he felt his grandfather would be overwhelmed by all the praise that he often receives from those who read the book. One person who was impressed by his grandfather's work asked Stuart if he knew how many people his grandfather saved. And they were surprised that Stuart said, yeah, he did know that. And even more surprised by the answer that he gave. None. He didn't save anyone. We don't save people. That's God's work. That's God's doing. Yes, God can work through us as he did through Bob Childress to help bring people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. But salvation as a gift doesn't come from us. It comes from God. As followers of Jesus, we place our hope in the work that he is doing in our world. And that should make us optimistic, but also humble. For you see, we're called to step out into this world in faith. And in a sense, it can be an awfully lonely journey. But we're called to put Jesus first in our lives. And when we do that, we also know that we're not alone. Kind of like I wasn't alone riding down Interstate 70. Our hope is in the overflowing love of God, a God who goes with us. Like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. We are called to step out in faith, trusting in God.